Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to this meeting of July the 15th, 2020. And I'd like to call the meeting to order. I just have a very brief comment. I want to thank you for your participation this evening. You're giving up your time once again. And it's a busy time of year when it shouldn't be a busy time of year, but that's the way it is. So our next meeting will be July 22nd, when we will receive a more fulsome operational report from the director. So Director, I would ask you to take roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, trustees. This is our roll call for our meeting, special board meeting of 15 July 2020. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Cram.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Jacobs. Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Thank you. Chair McAllister.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McRae.
Present, Steve.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Swan.
Present.
Thank you. Student Trustee Colton Kelford. Mr. Chair, you have quorum.
Thank you, Director. Article item 401, approval of the agenda. I have a motion moved by Trustee Cram, seconded by Trustee Barry, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve the special board meeting agenda of July 15, 2020. Please cast your ballots.
Chair McAllister, that motion does carry.
Thank you, Lisa. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Hearing none, I will move to Article 601, the proposed 2020-2021 budget. And at this time, I'm going to turn the proceeding over to Superintendent Jeremy Hobbs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just checking in to make sure that you can hear me, and I'll just wait for the PowerPoint to come up on your screens, which I can begin to see now. It's my pleasure to bring forth the proposed budget, original estimates for the 2021 fiscal year. Moving on to our next slide. As you know, this is a culmination of our several meetings that we've had to discuss various elements of the budget. I'm just checking in to see if we can move the slide along. There we go, thank you. So the budget process to date, just recapping where we've been so far, is, as you know, you've seen this slide a few times now, that our budget is really composed of two big parts. The funding part, which is largely comprised of the grants for student needs, the supplemental grants, and also, to the extent that they're available, the policy and partnership fund. So that also represents the funding. And as well, of course, there's our anticipated expenses for the upcoming fiscal year. And together, those two parts put together form our budget for 2021, which we're pleased to share with you this evening. On April 22nd, we presented to you a preliminary outlook for the 2021 budget based on our crystal ball view of the world as it was at that time, acknowledging fully that it's changed in ways that we couldn't even anticipate even back then at that stage of the game. The preliminary expense budget we presented to you on May 27th, which was an outline of the various spending commitments, the major spending commitments that we already had visibility into at that time, owing to our commitments associated with collective agreements and other requirements, as well as an outlook for the expenses that we reasonably thought we could forecast for the upcoming year. The third step, of course, was last Wednesday evening on July 8th. We presented you the revenue budget, or an overview of the Grants for Student Needs, or GSNs. At that time, we anticipated revenue available for compliance of approximately $376.6 million, along with an updated projected expense budget for compliance of $376.4 million. That would have resulted in an updated projected in-year surplus for compliance of $200,000 or $0.2 million for the year ending August 31st, 2021. The presentation this evening, of course, provides you the whole unified picture of expense and funding for the 2021 fiscal year. And I know that many of you are breathlessly awaiting in anticipation the bottom line, and I'm happy to report that it doesn't deviate very much at all from last week. So I think we still have a good story to tell. So moving on to slide 3 then. The budget process priorities, again, a slide that probably is familiar to you. As we started this year's budget process as a team, we thought through what would we like the experience for trustees and staff to be. Number one, we wanted for trustees to provide transparency and oversight, to make sure that trustees felt comfortable that they're able to exercise their oversight and decision-making roles in the time available. Every year we've gone through this. I think it's my, this is my 15th year going through the budget process with the Upper Canada District School Board. And really every year we experience quite a lot of empathy for the trustees who are trying to make tough decisions in a short period of time. And really what we wanted to do was do what we can to relieve some of that pressure, especially in the environment of uncertainty we're facing now. The second thing, of course, is compliance. And we wanted to make sure that the approved budget is compliant with all the ministry requirements, our contractual obligations, collective agreements, and all other requirements. And then finally, 3, we wanted to make sure that, especially again this year, we know that every year there's new challenges that crop up and new uncertainties that arise both at the start of the school year and throughout the year. But this year especially, we wanted to provide a mechanism for trustees to have the flexibility to address uncertainty and emerging priorities through the year. So as you know, the trustees have already gone through a planning exercise where they've gone through some thinking about what their program priorities might be for the upcoming school year. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, which has brought with it its own pressures and demands and uncertainties that we're experiencing in this very moment. And what we wanted to do was make sure that there was a mechanism in the budget for us to respond appropriately to the conditions as they unfold throughout the school year. And we'll show you tonight how we were able to do that. So moving on to slide 4 then. Just a few notes and assumptions about the proposed 2021 budget. First of all, the confirmed amounts of the Ministry of Education grants are included. So the finance team has been working hard, and we're working hard up until last Wednesday, July 8th, to get you the presentation that you received about GSNs last week. But of course, that work continued on to get the details and the numbers that we would be confident in presenting to you throughout the week. And in fact, that work post-budget approval, if that occurs this evening or beyond, that work will continue on as well. As you know, the government announced over $300 million in priorities and partnerships funds, or PPFs. So these are basically earmarked special project funds that are distinct from the GSN and supplemental grants. Of those, that $300 million, they've only announced $183 million, or sorry, they've only announced $117 million in terms of how it's going to be allocated. And of course, the specific board allocations are only about a half of that $117 million. So there remains a considerable amount of uncertainty and specifics to be discovered with regard to how the remainder of that $300 million is going to be allocated out to individual school boards and by priority. So that's additional revenue that we would expect. The projected in 2021 enrollment we've included is as of April 16th, 2020. So just reflecting that, because as you know, vast majority of our budget is driven by the actual pupils that we have in attendance at our schools in the upcoming year. As you also know, the EFIS Education Finance Information System forms are still being finalized. So that's the detailed work that the team will do both before, during, and after for a considerable period of time budget approval in order to actually submit the required information to the Ministry of Education. And I think one last item for us to consider is tonight what we've tried to do is present you a comparative analysis of this year's budget, or for 2021 budget, compared to the original estimates for 2019-20 budget that you passed back in June, just so you could start to see how things are evolving year over year. And I think in the vast majority of cases, you'll be pleased with the commitments that the government has made to support education in our area. Moving on to slide 5. So this is where the meat comes. I think I learned a little bit from Alfred Hitchcock about building suspense. So here we are when we get into the actual meat of the financial presentation. So just to summarize, here on slide 5, the title is Comparison Statement of Operations Revenue. And what you see is the broad categories for how our incoming revenue breaks down. So just starting at the top, 300 last year in 2019-20, the total ministry grant allocations forming our original estimates or our budget for the 2019-20 school year were $334 million. In budget 2021 that we're presenting tonight, that will increase to $344 million, 388,933, an increase of over $10 million, driven largely by increases to salary and benefit benchmarks associated with collective agreements, and also, as you know, the Support for Students Fund, which is about a $3 million increase that has been announced as part of the collective agreement settlement centrally. Throughout the rest of the lines, I won't drain these in detail slide by slide, but provincial grants other is actually obviously up by $4.8 million. Again, driven largely by the Education Worker Protection Fund that was a part of the CUPE Central Collective Agreement that was negotiated late fall 2019. And as you will recall, perhaps pre-COVID, the UCDSB was a disproportionate beneficiary of that Education Worker Protection Fund. So a big increase there. And then through the remaining lines, I won't go through them line by line, except to note that with regard to fees and revenue from other sources, including UCLC and C4K, what you see is an anticipated significant drop of $3.4 million, driven largely by anticipated reductions in the number of international students coming to study with us next year. And that was really, I think, what you will see for us is we have tried to, in light of the uncertainty around COVID, adopt a pretty uniform stance of conservatism throughout our projections so that we are not encountering any significant surprises going into the next school year. So the bottom line for revenue, last year's total revenue, $370,179,360. And this year we're forecasting a total revenue of $382,022,862, or an increase of $11.8 million year over year in total revenue. I'd like to just at this point just make the distinction here that this is not revenue for compliance. So as you'll note, school generated funds is included here in the total revenue estimate. And when we're talking about revenue available for compliance, the ministry's reporting rules do not allow us to include school generated funds. So that's just something you will note later, and I'll try to make a note of it as well as we encounter sections that are relevant to that note. Moving on to slide 6 then. As I mentioned earlier, the other half of our budget, of course, is the companion to revenue is the expense side. Overall, as no surprise, instruction forms the broad bulk of our expense budget. So in 2019-20, our budget related to instruction was $263 $4,821,260, and that will increase by approximately $12.6 million to $276,467,716. That is a significant increase, and of course, as you know, is further to my earlier comments, largely due to increases in funding that have been provided associated with negotiated increases to salary benchmarks through the collective bargaining process, supports for students fund, and so on. So you've seen the revenue side previously. This is now a reflection of the fact that we intend to spend that according to the terms and conditions that have been associated with those revenue sources. Moving on, again, administration and governance stays flat. This is a key area of our compliance envelope, so I would say down slightly by approximately $30,000, so more or less flat. Transportation, a slight increase, or an increase of $1.6 million year over year. Pupil accommodation, a slight reduction of approximately $760,000. This is largely close to my heart because it's the facilities area, largely reflecting a shift in or the continued implementation of the supplementary area factor, as I mentioned in last week's presentation. Other non-operating costs reflect a reduction of approximately $567,000 year over year, largely related to expense constraint in UCLC. Again, what they're trying to do as they anticipate less revenue coming from international students, they're also trying to constrain their operations to the extent possible without compromising their ability to continue to attract international students and scale back up should conditions permit. Amortization expense, which really refers to the ongoing amortization of our major capital assets, slight change of $819,000, and school-generated funds anticipating a drop in expenses of approximately $400,000, and I believe that is largely driven by anticipated reductions in activity associated with pandemic. So overall, this leaves us with a total expense budget of $377,793,417. That represents an increase of $13 million over 2019-20. And again, as you can see from the increase-decrease column, largely driven by salaries and benefits associated with collective agreements. For those interested in flipping right to the last page of the book, the original budget for 2021 then would produce a total in-year surplus of $4.2 million, or $4.229 million. And part of the reason why I mentioned the distinction between total revenue, total expenses, and revenue available for compliance is that this includes, again, expenses related to school-generated funds, which are not part of our compliance calculation. So even though we are showing a $4.2 million surplus, that is not entirely accessible for compliance purposes, which we'll continue to explain as the presentation proceeds. So moving forward onto slide 7. This slide, of course, we know that special education is an area of particular interest for trustees who we know from history care deeply about serving our children with special needs. It's also an area of a significant expenditure for our board, so we actually highlight this area in particular. The original budget for 2019-20 had total spec ed revenue of $41.5 million. The original budget for 2021 sees that increasing slightly to $43.1 million, an increase of $1.5 million year over year. And again, very subject to changes in benchmark rates there, rather than anything significant in terms of an increase in service level. Total expenses were $48,422,000 in 2019-20. Increasing to $50,764,452 in 2020-21, and that represents an increase year over year of $2.3 million in expenses. So we consider this department, we sometimes look at its own little surplus and deficit. So last year, 2019-20, that would have produced a departmental deficit of $6.8 million, and that deficit for the spec ed area would climb to $7.6 million in this fiscal year. However, what's extremely important to note is that, as I've mentioned on a couple of occasions on previous slides, is that there has been a significant infusion of special education resources that have been driven through the collective bargaining process, and particularly the supports for students funds and systems priorities that are actually sequestered or directed to be spent on special education. So as you can see in the line on slide 7, which outlines incremental funding supports for special education staffing, we are also, through these mechanisms, seeing an additional $3.165 million in funding supports for special education, which has the immediate effect of reducing that surplus, that deficit, for the special education area. So in effect, instead of a deficit of $7.6 million in the special education area, we apply now $3.16 million in incremental funding. And that leads us with a special education deficit, if you will, of $4.473 million. So that's a really big, significant funding boost for the special education area, and it's a very significant driver in our ability to maintain and continue to evolve the service level in spec ed per last year's special education review and many of the actual new programs that have been implemented in that area. Moving on to the next slide then, slide 8. Another major significant portion of our budget, which doesn't show on the statement of operations necessarily, is in terms of compliance, is the capital expenses. So in the next year, the short version of this is that we're anticipating to spend approximately $40 million in capital enhancements and improvements to our schools. That includes everything from continuing work on projects to build entirely new schools, such as the Brockville JK-6 school, and also continuing to build additions, such as at North Granville District High School and Roxmore, and then of course using school condition improvement dollars, school renewal dollars, which helps us do renovations and other projects like parking lots and those kinds of things. We are also continuing to work through our other sources of capital, which would include early years and childcare capital, full day kindergarten capital, of which we are still working on depleting, and then minor tangible capital assets, which are things that are smaller in value and that depreciate over a shorter period of time. So overall, very significant infusion of approximately $40 million into our local economy. I think one other point I'd like to make here is that for those of you who may be looking at projects near and dear to your heart, namely the new Brockville JK-6 school, where we anticipate spending $900,000 in 2021, just like to reassure you that is not the sum total of funding that's available for those projects. It's strictly what we anticipate spending in the upcoming school year. And what you find as we get deeper into those projects, obviously the rate of spending will accelerate and you'll see those numbers go up year over year. But again, I think at a time when all of us are mindful about the local economies of our respective communities, it's another big way that we are contributing to getting economies and businesses moving in our communities again. And moving forward to the next slide. So slide 9, the intention here is to give you a sense of where we're going to start the year from a statement of our position and where we anticipate ending the year if things materialize as we've laid out in the past 8 slides. So the first column where it says balance at September 1st, 2020, this is a column that is straight out of financial forecast number 3, which you saw a few weeks ago, where we were telling you how we saw ourselves ending the 1920 fiscal year on August 31st. And I suppose it's a good thing that the way we end up on August 31st should be exactly pretty much the same as what we wake up to on September 1st of the school year. So this column should be hopefully familiar to you. where we're essentially our operating surplus that we anticipate to have at September 1st of 2020 will be approximately $2 million. Through the course of the year, we anticipate that increasing by about $100,000 to $2.1 million at August 31st, 2021. The total internally appropriated surplus available for compliance, and this includes things like school budget surpluses or carry forwards, allocations for WSIB, accumulated surpluses for Champions for Kids, things that actually have restricted uses, but those restrictions come from within the board. We anticipate having a balance at September 1st of $8.8 million. That will increase by about another $100,000 throughout the year, ending the year at $8.9 million. So at the end of August 31st, 2021, we anticipate our budget surplus that we anticipate experiencing next year of about $200,000 or $0.2 million, which you see in the blue row. That will contribute to a total accumulated surplus available for compliance on August 31st, 2021 of $11 million. And again, as you'll see later, I believe last year trustees expressed an appetite to rebuild our accumulated surplus available for compliance for a variety of reasons. One of them was, I think, some appetite to have some sort of measure of risk reserve that could be potentially accessible. And the target was approximately $10 million, I believe, at the time. And as you know from financial forecast number 3, barring any unforeseen circumstances, we anticipate hitting that quite a bit earlier than what we had expected last year in June 2019. If you look through the next row down, row 4, it says totally externally appropriated available, and it's unavailable for compliance, I'm sorry. This is essentially a surplus that is we maintain that's imposed by sort of external requirements, and this really predominantly consists of basically a fund to support a liability associated with employee future benefits, particularly related to retirement gratuity. And for a number of years, every year we've been putting approximately $4 million a year against that liability, which you see reflected in the middle column. We're going to continue to put $4 million against it next year. And by the time we end up at August 31st, 2021, we should have an accumulated surplus, externally appropriated surplus, which is unavailable for compliance of $12.5 million. So overall, hearkening back to my first couple of slides where we talked about the total surplus at year end, we will anticipate being $4.2 million, but obviously based on this, only $0.2 million of that is actually available for compliance and something that the board could ultimately access if it so chose through another fiscal year. Moving forward to slide 10 then. So what does this mean for compliance? And again, this is the slide you see. So again, what you see here is that the in-year revenues for compliance purposes, and these are the revenues, not the total revenues of the board, but the total revenues of the board minus those elements that are only including those elements that are available for compliance purposes, so not including school generated funds, $376,199,304 in anticipated in-year revenues for 2021. In-year expenses for 2021 of $375,974,444. And subtracting those two numbers leaves us with an in-year surplus for compliance purposes of $224,860 or $0.2 million. As you know, in addition to passing a balanced budget, a compliant budget in the eyes of the Ministry of Education is one that is a deficit of no more than 1% of our operating allocation. Obviously, because this is a surplus budget we're proposing, the budget would automatically be compliant, and because our administration governance envelope is within, our administration and governance plan spend is within the envelope funding amount, we are also compliant there as well. So compliant on all fronts. Moving to slide 11 then. So this slide, as you're well familiar with, shows what the sort of multi-year financial outlook is. And of course, as things get further distant out from where we are today, it becomes harder and harder to actually predict with a level of accuracy what is going to happen. But what we try to do is make assumptions that if current patterns can more or less continue, what will likely happen. The first component of this graph I'd like to draw your attention to are the orange bars, and I apologize if that's not orange or if it's red or something, but you see an orange bar and a blue bar. The orange bar was represents the accumulated surplus trend that we thought we were going to have as of September 2019. So as you can see, the first orange bar in September of 2019, we were projecting at the end of this year to have $1.9 million in accumulated surplus available for compliance. The blue bar, on the other hand, represents what we see happening as of now. So as you can see, that blue bar under the 2019-20 projection is obviously much higher, and it represents that $10.8 million accumulated surplus available for compliance that we are anticipating or forecasting to have at the end of fiscal 2019-20. Again, last year at this time, or in September, we thought that the end of 2021 might be another just a straight balanced budget with no money to put towards an accumulated surplus available for compliance. However, based on the 2021 budget we are presenting tonight, we are now anticipating that that would go up by, we would have an extra $200,000 or $224,000 at year end to apply towards our accumulated surplus available for compliance. And if that was the case, our total board's accumulated surplus available for compliance would be $11 million. Beyond that, it's difficult to actually project with any reasonable certainty about what would happen. But I think what is important on this slide is the green hashed horizontal line at the $10 million level, and that represents the threshold that trustees have set for a desired level of accumulated surplus available for compliance. And as you can see, our forecast for 1920 exceeds that level. And if adopted, the proposed budget for 2021, based on what we know now, would propose to modestly increase that level as well. Moving on to slide 12. As you recall from one of my earlier slides, and I think I've presented a few times now, is one of our top 3 priorities for this budget process was to recognize the extreme amounts of uncertainty being faced by trustees, and what we would guess is an appetite to give these uncertainties due consideration and to apply resources where they're needed to best support the needs of our students. So to that end, as we've discussed in the past, finance staff and the senior team have worked together to see if we could identify sources of funding that as yet or are anticipated to be uncommitted that the board could at a later date choose to direct towards local priorities, and by local priorities, those could be the priorities that trustees have already identified, such as health and well-being specialists in schools, further expansions of the Power Up program, transportation contingencies, further application to the accumulated surplus available for compliance, and or trustees could choose on an as-needed basis to apply this to our pandemic response. And so some of the sources that we see as being sources of opportunity, and I'd like to emphasize that the team has really not presented what I would consider to be any wild and unlikely ideas here. These are all things that we feel stand a reasonable chance of coming to fruition or are virtual certainties. So, you know, just to enumerate some of these potential opportunities for budget, the priorities and partnerships funding, as I mentioned earlier, the province has announced $300 million province-wide in PPF funding. I believe $183 million of that $300 million has yet to be allocated. And even of the $117 million that has been assigned to specific priorities, only half of that has been allocated to specific boards. So for the Upper Canada District School Board, I believe that amount is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.1 million that's been allocated already. And there's significant funding yet to come when the government gets around to being able to identify what those priorities and those allocations are. And that could be a consideration in terms of this flexibility fund, if you will, that trustees could allocate later. As you also know, the special incidents portion is an initiative that is another funding source, a claims-based funding source that we can apply for students who have intensive special education needs. Something that's been spearheaded by Superintendent Ferguson in his capacity as Superintendent of Spec Ed, and continued on by Superintendent Perry as she's taken over the portfolio and to extend that claims-based process. As you know, for the upcoming fiscal year 2021, we've been quite conservative in terms of the anticipated revenue. We're anticipating, we've only budgeted $750,000 in revenue for 2021, but the amount of claims we're anticipating to be in the $3 million range. If that remaining revenue, the difference between $3 million and $750,000 materializes, that's money that we could use. Obviously, we'll direct it to special education, but that could, in theory, liberate other funds that would allow us to respond to emerging or current priorities as they stand. We also know rural and northern education funds annually represents about $1.4 million. There have been some draws against the RNEF funds for 2021 to support distance learning and also grad coaches, but it hasn't been entirely depleted. And we also have deferred revenue from 2019-2020 RNEF that we can use again for this fund in 2020-21. And there may be other sources of deferred revenue. The bottom line is that even if trustees were to pass the proposed budget with a $224,000 surplus available for compliance, or projected surplus at the end of 2021, this flex fund would provide an additional $1 to potentially $4.8 million in uncommitted funds that we're anticipating accessing in the 2021 school year that could be applied on an ongoing basis as situations emerge. So what we're hoping is that this brings trustees some comfort that even though there are priorities, both known and unknown, that have not yet been explicitly addressed within the budget, this fund does provide the opportunity to have some think time and a little bit of breathing room and to make and to respond, especially in the environment of extreme uncertainty we're facing today. And finally, maybe not finally, but slide 13. Maybe we can just advance. Thank you. So yeah, maybe finally. So what does this all mean? So we've taken you through a lot of numbers, and I think it's important sometimes to take a breather back and look at what is this, what are the benefits to schools in our system of this draft 2020-21 budget? Well, the first thing, of course, is that we have a student-focused budget with the flexibility to respond to the operational context in September. As you've seen through our discussions of revenue and expense lines, we've been beneficiaries of very significant funding increases from the Ministry of Education, both through collective bargaining and just in response or through the GSN process. While we haven't actually finished off the specifics around how we're going to allocate every last dime, it does afford the possibility of over 100 additional staff to restore or enhance support for students through this incremental funding. So, you know, between the Support for Students Fund and the Education Worker Protection Fund in particular, very significant investments in additional staff resources thanks to that funding source. We've also included in the budget, it's included a $1 million plus investment in technology refresh to enhance the student digital experience. That includes, based on our projections, over 1,000 additional computers or PC type devices for students, as well as continuing implementation of the Ministry of Education's Broadband Modernization Initiative, which is going to bring order of magnitude increases in network bandwidth to our schools once kids get back at it. We've already identified in this budget presentation close to a $40 million investment in school and childcare capital construction, additions, improvements, and retrofits. The teams are already out in the field completing the work that they can complete. They brought everything to a pause when the pandemic hit, but then equally rapidly started getting work out the door, and that's good for our kids and it's good for our communities. Again, thanks to that ongoing funding commitment from the Ministry of Education. We're projecting again a modest projected surplus of $224,000. I think it's important for us to grow the accumulated surplus balance modestly, but I think it's also important for us, front of mind, to actually put money where it's needed, which is as much as possible in support of students. So we feel comfortable with our modest projected surplus and happy that we are actually approaching or even breaching the trustees' stated level of accumulated surplus balance that they were hoping to achieve last year. And then finally, of course, we're compliant with all the Ministry of Education requirements, our contractual obligations, and other requirements. So very satisfied that this budget is something that will be accepted by the Ministry of Education in every respect. And moving forward to slide 14. So in summary, tonight we're proposing an expense budget for compliance of $375.97 million with a forecasted surplus of $0.22 million or $224,000 for 2020-21. It will include the capacity to add over 100 additional staff supports that are directly impacting students, over $50 million in direct support to special education, over a $1 million investment in technology and connectivity, and over $40 million in forecasted capital expenditures to improve and revitalize our schools. Budget's fully compliant with ministry requirements. It puts the board on track to ahead of schedule, in fact, to meet our accumulated surplus targets. And then on top of that, staff have identified between $900,000 and $4.8 million in uncommitted revenue that we can use to later respond to emerging priorities and the COVID-19 pandemic. And moving on to slide 15, I just have to confess that every time I presented a finance presentation to the board, I have written down on my notes that I want to thank the people who were the real architects of the work I've had the privilege to present. And I'm ashamed to say that I keep forgetting. So this time I stuck a slide in here so I wouldn't forget. So if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to really thank the finance department team, alphabetical order, Christy Carter, Jamie Crosby, Jessica Devlin, Rebecca Garlow, Diana Kingston, and of course Michael Law. And I'd also like to thank the senior team and department leadership that supports the budget development. This is really, it's a presentation that I have the privilege of doing, but it's really the work of many, many people and the thinking of many, many people over many months. So thanks to everyone for this opportunity. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Hobbs. I have to tell you that that was a very concise, clear presentation. Before we open the floor to discussion, I would like to read the motion, which perhaps I should have done to begin with. It's moved by Trustee Danaher and seconded by Trustee McPherson, if that's okay, everybody, that the Upper Canada District School Board approves the 2020-2021 annual projected operating expenses of $377,793,417 and capital expenses of $40,432,085 plus all amounts subsequently allocated by the Ministry of Education. I am opening the floor to discussion.
I have some questions, Trustee Schooler. Through you,
Go ahead,
Chair.
Trustee Schooler.
So we've been told that there are 3 possible scenarios for the start of the school year in September. Do these numbers that we've been presented with tonight, do they apply to all of the 3 scenarios, or are they germane to one scenario in particular? And I'm just wondering if it would have been more helpful as the trustees make these decisions, if we could have had a more precise idea of what each of these scenarios would have looked like financially. For example, on slide 6 in the instruction line, if we are required to staff our schools with 15 students in a classroom and 1 teacher, will that instruction amount cover the number of teachers that we are going to need given that scenario?
Would Director or Superintendent Hobbs, would you care to answer that question?
I can start, and perhaps the director or the director, his pleasure, may want to start.
Mr. Chair, through you, well, why don't we begin with Superintendent Hobbs, and then if there's anything else I can confirm or add, I'd be happy to do so. Over to Superintendent Hobbs.
Sure. I think where I would start is that the budget really reflects, for lack of a better way of putting it, is all 3 scenarios. And the reason for that largely is because most of our expenses, the vast majority of our expenses, are salaries and benefits that are driven by contractual commitments. And regardless of what the scenario is, those contractual commitments have to be met. So in fact, the actual process of making those expense commitments to staffing levels is driven by the collective agreement, and started occurring back in the March-April timeframe, and has long since actually been staffed up. So, I think that the scenario we're in is that the contractual commitments and the commitments that we have to make on the expense side are largely what they are. And we find ourselves in the position of trying to use whatever room is left over in order to respond to the conditions as they may lie. I would say that thinking about my former HR hat, we don't have very much latitude to do a radical restaff of really any employee area, and certainly not on the timelines that we're talking about now. So that to me is kind of the broad picture. The second part of that, of course, is the funding, in which the funding is also driven largely formulaically and in response to our collective agreements and our other contractual obligations. So it's really a reflection of where the funding source goes. And the challenge for us, as you can see us attempting to do, is to try and figure out how we actually use the remaining flexibility that's available to us, while remaining compliant with all of those externally imposed factors, to be able to respond effectively as the circumstances permit. So that gives you perhaps a bit of a rationale for the scenario we're addressing. We're really addressing a budget that's driven by the commitments that we are legitimately obligated to undertake, and trying to find the flexibility to deal with the response, like all boards are, in the remaining. And perhaps the director may choose to add on to that.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would. In addition to what Mr. Hobbs has shared, we heard that these costs are fixed costs in terms of our employee salaries. If there was a need, as Trustee Schooler had identified, for additional staff, it would stand to reason that we would come to the board with that scenario outlined, and tonight's budget being presented presents that opportunity for any COVID-related scenario costs that we think would go over and above anything that we would be planning for, certainly. And as we know, and as you heard this evening, in this environment of extreme uncertainty, we're trying to make sure that we're mindful of a wide range of scenarios, including what Trustee Schooler had identified. And if indeed that the projection was for additional staff, we know that we have to come to the board to bring that forward, because at that point we would have that operational need confirmed, and therefore be requesting the board's support in that regard. Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you.
Trustee Schooler, does that answer your question?
Yes, I had read today that the Toronto District School Board had costed out this scenario if they had to divide students into groups of 15 with one teacher. That would require an additional 2,500 teachers at a cost of $249 million. Now, I recognize that we're not anywhere close to the TDSB, but I'm just wondering if we have in fact gone into that detail to cost out the exact amount that would be required to fund a 15-to-1 student-teacher ratio, and what that number would be.
Thank you. Response?
It's Jeremy. I don't know if the director would like to take that one again first, or I can attempt.
Well, sure, I'll begin, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hobbs. What I would advise the board is that in a 15-to-1 scenario, in that adapted model, the adapted model presupposes that we have only some students at school on a given day, and other students would come at a later time. So it wouldn't necessarily result in the adapted model that our board is looking at right now, our operational staff are looking at, that there would be a double the employment expenses or employee expenses, but instead we would need to anticipate if there were additional program needs in that adapted model, what in fact would those costs be. These are still early days, and we're not at that point yet, Mr. Chair, but as I mentioned in my earlier comments, we would certainly be coming back to the board if in fact we came to the conclusion that those expenses would be beyond what we were anticipating. I'll also ask Mr. Hobbs if he wanted to add anything further.
No, I think that captures it for me. I think it's a question that's front of mind for all of us as we consider the school opening, and but I think the director's captured it.
Good. Thank you very much, everyone. I just want to. Okay, just a moment, please. I just want to point out that we're straying a little bit into the operational side, which we will be getting a report on next Wednesday. But I do understand how they are integrated. Was that Trustee Swan?
Yes, and I too am probably straying on the operational side, because if we do go to Model A or Model B, I guess you have said it's coming to the board. I mean, we haven't seen the agenda for next week, but I'm very concerned about staffing levels. If we go full time, and then if we go online, are we using community-based sources? So the schools that are overflowing might need staffing, whether we use churches or community halls. So this will be coming to us next week. Is that correct? I mean, I feel it very unfair that we have to pass a budget with so many unknowns. It's not good for our staff. It's not good for our students. And anyway, that's just my 10 cents worth.
I have something to say, Mr. Chair, if I may. John McCrae.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you. I can't see putting 10.8 million in surplus when our schools may very well need retrofits now. There's nobody's going to wave a wand on August 31st saying it's ready to go next day if we need ventilation systems, or if we need wellness rooms for students who take sick, or vulnerable teachers who perhaps need to be separated. There are some capital issues here that I reject this. There's no way that if there's something wrong with people I care about, I'm going to put money away somewhere in a bank rather than spend it on helping them when they're in crisis. And as far as I can see, we're in crisis. So there, that's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I just want to point out that our schools are being well taken care of. Conditions are safe, and we are planning as best we can with the knowledge and the revenue that we have based on the government's presentation to us as recently as last week. I will continue.
Supplemental, if
next-
I may.
Yes.
There'll be no blame in the government when they have given it to us. It's our responsibility now. And I haven't heard no one talk about these wellness rooms in the schools that would require a retrofit. Has something been done about that? Has somebody collaborated and talked with the health units? What is happening on that front?
Trustee McCray, I think you are straying out of the issue of the evening, which is the budget. If you would like a presentation, no, seriously, if you want a presentation in wellness rooms, we will give you a presentation in wellness rooms, but not tonight.
Well, if it's not about the budget, what is it about?
Next question.
I have another question, please, in regards to slide 13 and 14.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan. Go ahead, Trustee Swan. We'll come back to Trustee Swan. Is there another question?
Mr. Chair, it's Steve Sliwa here. Just want to bring to your attention, you have a speakers list in the chat box to the left or right of the screen. Trustee McPherson is queued up first, Trustee Parisian queued up second, and Trustee McDonald is queued up third.
Okay, I apologize. I did not see that. I'm getting to it now. So we will go with Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. In regards to potential unexpected expenses, as Trustee Schooler was referring to, is there any indication or possibility of, I'll use the term top-up funding from the ministry in addition to the standard allotments for the budget that we have in front of us? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. It's Jeremy here. I believe actually the government has actually provided a modest allotment, and I believe I touched on it last week, of I think $25 million approximately province-wide that was to cover a little bit of technology and some other items that were directly related to the COVID response. So that's really the only earmarked pandemic response. Actually, it's $10 million province-wide for mental health to support the continued well-being of students, and $15 million to support technology-related costs associated with the COVID response. There has been some signal from the government that with regard to those PPFs, that there is some possibility of, and I believe so far it was only for the 19-20 fiscal year, of repurposing those in some respect to the pandemic response. I think the other thing that if I sort of may indulge the chair may indulge me just one moment longer, one of the things that we have been successful in the facilities department is the facilities operations group represents approximately $35 million of annual spend on building maintenance, operations, custodial support, and so on. So the team there is already mobilized on stockpiling, quote unquote PPE in preparation for the start of the school year. We've already rolled out plexiglass, or in the process of rolling out plexiglass shields for school offices. Team in the procurement department is working on signage and purchasing those kinds of things. And in addition, really right now the focus is on those kinds of not capital related items, but on more supplies and equipment that's related. But we do actually, as I mentioned, have a $40 million capital planned spend this year. And that would be on more or less routine facility retrofits. But for those kinds of expenses, if there were expenditures that are needed for the pandemic, and they would qualify to be categorized as capital, we do have a significant capital program, as I indicated, that we could mobilize in the service of those kinds of needs as well. So just a few additional items to think about in terms of the flexibility for the pandemic response.
Thank you very much. I would like to go to Trustee Parisien, who has two questions apparently.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. My first question is from slide number 8, school condition improvements of 21 million. Do we have a list, or do you have a list of the schools that have already been sort of cited for those improvements, or will that be an ongoing list as per required throughout the year?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's the actual list of projects in all stages of completion is included monthly in your board report as an information item. So as you may be aware, those consist of projects more or less that have concluded in the last probably 4 or 5 years by the time we get them all closed out and billing's all done and accounting's tidied up and everything. And then in addition, anything that is in play this summer or we anticipate early next year would be included in that list too. But I believe it's actually sorted by trustee as well and would list the schools. If there's an appetite for greater detail on a project that's occurring at a school, then please feel free to let me know and I can give you some more details on what's going on. And I know I owe Trustee McPherson an explanation at CHIMO too, so to make my point.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Also, I had one other question on, I don't remember what slide it was, but there was a mention of 1,000 technology devices. Do we believe that's enough with everything that's going on?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm an IT guy, so there's never enough technology, but we're actually already are in the process of buying around 1,200 devices right now. So that will be, that extra 1,000 next year will be in addition to that. And again, if that's an area of appetite for the board where the conditions demand that we require more devices, I think that, that's one of those things that we would bring back to the board for consideration at the time. I think right now we've had some discussions around should we buy more, where should they go, but we're a little reluctant to commit large amounts of resources at right now in August with how sort of fluid the situation looks to be for September. So that's something that's of consequence for us, but those 2,500 or so devices will have a very big impact.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Parisien. I just want to maybe apologize to Trustee McCray. His question was somewhat with regard to the placing of resources available to the board, which is an operational issue, versus the process which we are planning, in which we are involved right now, and that is governance. So that's what we are doing now. I would like to open the floor now to Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to echo your comments previously about this report. Great information for us to be able to move forward with, and I want to remind trustees this is about a budget that's based on what we're going to be doing in 2021, and it's based on the hiring that we did probably about 3 months ago. And so it doesn't have a lot of calculations that are put into place with some of the changes or the adjustments that maybe have transpired over the last 2 weeks. And so, to follow up on some questions from Trustee Schooler and just to pick up on what Superintendent Hobbs talked about earlier, is there flexibility within this budget that we have to be able to respond? I mean, there is certainly definitive numbers as far as staffing that we have. But is there flexibility in order to be able to respond from a facility standpoint, but also just an operational standpoint within the schools that we have moving forward? Should we adjust some things in September?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would say that there's, I think, two major approaches that we can tap into for the purposes of flexibility to respond to major circumstances. So, of course, the one major one that I highlighted for you on slide 12, I believe, is the potential opportunities for flexibility that could be up to around $4.8 million. And, it includes deferred revenue that we know of from 1920 fiscal year, as well as the allocation in 2021. It also, if the SIP revenue materializes over the course of the next couple months in a level commensurate with the claims that were submitted, that would add another $2.3 million. So, there's very significant funds there. I would say that, the rest of the flexibility, should we need to respond, would depend. And by that, I mean, if we had to hire, for example, twice as many teachers as we currently have, our budget does not have the capacity to withstand that. And I think that would have to be a separate conversation that you would be having, or all boards would be having, with the Ministry of Education. With regard to facilities, as I mentioned earlier, the facilities, I have two major areas of funding within my facilities budget, so I'm putting on my facilities hat. Again, around $35 million in facilities operations funding. And to give you an illustration of the thinking that my team is already working on for next year, they're already working on how they would eliminate split shifts. So you may have heard of the notion of split shifts, where a custodian will come into a school for a few hours in the morning, open up the school, shovel the sidewalks and so on, and then they'll go home for a few hours and come back and clean for after the kids are gone, because that's when most of the deep cleaning happens. The problem is that in a COVID world, there's cleaning that needs to go on intensively during the day when kids are at school. So my team has actually already worked on a tentative plan for eliminating all those split shifts, so we can ensure that in the pandemic response, there are custodians at all the schools all the time during the day to support the cleaning needs. And that would be that we have a plan to cover that out of our existing facilities operations budget. So no incremental spend that would be required on the board. It would represent a shifting of what we do in the budget. Same thing for PPE. So we've equipped custodians with PPE and are stockpiling PPE and cleaning supplies. Again, that's coming out of our normal facilities budget. And again, I would say the richest area in some respects from a financial standpoint is on the capital side. The issue really on the capital side is that you need to have large projects in order to qualify for capital funding. So you're not talking about painting or, putting up a partition or something. You're talking about moving walls and doing fairly significant renovations, which is time consuming. What we're seeing is difficulty in getting contractor responsiveness, because contractors are actually getting busy doing all kinds of work, and it's hard to do when kids are in school. But it certainly is another opportunity that we can tap into. So the two categories of flexibility, I would say, are the reserve funds that we've actually set aside, or we are planning on setting aside or identifying that we could allocate, and that's explicit. But there are other areas within the board budget where, if it becomes apparent to us that we're operating in a very adapted state, we may choose to stop doing some things or postpone doing some things or do things differently for a period of time within our existing departmental operating budgets. And that I just spoke to the facilities side of things as an example of how we are planning on a COVID response without adding to the incremental pressure on expenditures for the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have another question, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you. So, and I'm satisfied with that, and I think that's reasonable for us to expect that the budget that we have before us is based on the information that we have available today, and there is that opportunity to have some potential flexibility. So I'm supportive of the budget. What I would like to do, though, is talk about some things that might come up, and more in particular to slide 11, and it might be what Trustee McCray was alluding to as well. I want to support this budget. I want to pass the budget tonight, but I also want to bring forward a motion that will talk about some things that, if we look at slide 11, shows the projection and the ability for us to to reach that target of 3% or $10 million. And I don't necessarily want to alter that tonight. What I want to do, though, is to make sure that in September, that if we do get additional funds, that we are brought up to speed on a very quick basis, so a monthly basis as trustees, so that whether we're getting SIP funding, whether we're getting PPF, whether we're getting rural, northern, or any sort of deferred revenue that might be coming into play, that we get that report to the board so that we are not, dealing with this in quarter 2, quarter 3, so that then we are adding to the surplus. It's incumbent, it's important for us to make sure that the funds that we get are used for the kids that are in school today. And I think if we have this type of information moving forward, it'll allow us as trustees to understand the extra revenue that has come in, the plan that's in place to deal with that revenue, and then what does that do to impact the existing budget. Superintendent Hobbs talked about it. If we do get SIP funding, we can put SIP funding in place for special education and then reallocate money that we would have taken from other areas of the budget to support special education. So it gives us an opportunity to support more kids in different ways. I talked about this last week. It's important for us to make sure that we have those plans in place as a board, corporate board, and that we have those triggers in place so that when we do get the funding, we're nimble, we're able to roll things out very quickly, and we're not having large amounts of cash to deal with at the end of the school year. So, I want to just say that I'm supportive of the budget, but I also want to make sure that we put some oversight in place for the trustees, come September as we see this. So, I want to be able to support the budget tonight, pass it, and then I would like to bring forward another motion, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Your motion is noted, and it will be brought forward after we pass this budget. Is it okay?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's the intent.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Swan.
Yes, sorry, I guess I remuted myself. Okay, my comment or question was in regards to slide 13, and it said $1 million surplus to enhance student digital experience. But my question out of that statement is, what are we doing to help staff? Where in this budget is equipment for them? And I'm not necessarily talking teachers, but when we went into digital learning or online learning last year, many staff that still were expected to support students had to use their home-based computers and did not have access to school devices, and many of them, but I've heard from many that had to go buy their own or try to buy used ones to try and support them in their roles to support students. So what are we doing for our staff? Because if our staff can't support students, which really need it in an online learning environment, giving the money to the students isn't really helping a lot if we don't have our staff available to support them. So where is that money in that budget? Because I can't see it.
Okay,
through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry.
You are straying a little bit into operational issues, but would Superintendent Hobbs, would you care to address this issue?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think Trustee Swan is correct. We have, I think, over 4,000 full-time staff and approximately 21,000 board-owned devices now in our environment. So PCs and mostly PCs, laptops, iPads. It wasn't, I think, it was as recent as 2016. Before 2016, no teachers even had a device assigned to them. And the board made a pretty significant budget commitment at that time to equip every teacher with a device, and we went on a lease. So well over 2,000 additional machines in our environment. And I think that since that time, there's been some conversation about ECEs having them, or even EAs having access to a dedicated device. And you're correct, in this particular budget, we have not allocated additional funds. And part of that is because, I think that it's just has not been part of the, I think it hasn't been front of mind given that the budget scenario over the course of the past couple of years has been what it is. I think the other thing that's important for us is that we lease those devices on a 3-year basis. So, I think that the logical time to consider a radical expansion of that kind of device footprint would probably be when we renew the teacher devices next on a lease. But certainly if it was the appetite of the trustees to allocate that kind of budget, we could look at it. I would just suggest that it probably usually when you're dealing with numbers of that magnitude, it takes us several months to actually spec, acquire, and deploy those kinds of devices. So it would take some time and planning for us to do it, and not sure that we could get it fully mobilized for the 2021 fiscal year.
At a question from
Secondary?
Yes, go ahead.
Then can we ask, or how would we go about asking that we at least look into it? I mean, this is a pandemic. It may be gone, but I mean, to be prepared. Plus, we're in a digital era. I think it's important for these staff, and these are staff supporting students, that I think it's very important that they have the devices available to them as part of their employment. So how do we direct, as a board of trustees, do I have to bring a motion for this? I guess I should. So should I do it tonight or wait till the planning and administration next week?
Trustee Swan, based on the previous answer from Superintendent Hobbs, is that necessary? I think he has addressed the question that everybody has a device. Am I wrong?
No, EAs don't have devices. Support staff don't have devices. People that are supporting our students at home don't have them. Only our teachers do. And during the online learning module, many people were expected to support our students in online learning and didn't have access to devices that could even access Teams because they had to use their personal ones. And that's my concern.
Superintendent Hobbs, would you have a reply to that?
I could give a shot. I think that, the approach that I would take in response to that kind of query, which certainly we welcome, I think would normally be for me to go to my staff and to sort of develop a series of options or a series of plans. And that would look like, for us, would be identifying the employee groups that might be candidates for receiving devices, looking at the total numbers of people we'd be talking about, specifying a device or class of devices with a unit cost, and then costing it all out and producing a plan for inclusion in an eventual budget consideration. And based on a allocation to the affirmative, then we go through procurement as part of the broader public sector procurement. Usually, like when we did this with teachers in 2014-15, it was a full I would say probably year end to end before we actually started rolling the devices out and all the planning. There's a really significant amount of planning and technology to deal with at scale, even when we're not in a pandemic situation.
Thank you. So you'll be looking into this then?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if that's the direction of the board, we'd certainly be happy to do that.
Thank you very much. Trustee Schooler?
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Just for my own clarification, I have a couple of questions about surplus. In order for a board to be compliant, is it a requirement that they have a surplus? And if so, does that surplus have to be a certain percentage of their yearly budget? And then to pick up, I believe, on Trustee McCrae's point, as I look ahead to 25-26 projection, a surplus of $19 million, and thinking globally that we live in a province that is in pretty dire financial straits, how do we as a board justify having $19 million of taxpayers' money sitting in the bank? And is the province, do they have the right to take that surplus back from school boards and apply it to any other expenses that they might have?
Superintendent Hobbs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I may rely on your support because there's a few questions in there, and I was trying to keep track. I think the first, if I recall, the first question was the nature of what we consider to be compliance, and I guess I don't know if you have the paper in front of you, but the slide with the little gauge on it is one that sort of hits the nail on the head there. I'm just trying to track it down. Slide 10. Basically, boards are, I guess, strongly encouraged to pass a balanced budget, which would mean to me revenues are equal to expenses. The compliance threshold, boards are required, they may, under certain circumstances, pass a deficit budget or run a deficit, but the budget would not be considered to be compliant unless it was within or had a deficit of less than $3.4 million, so 1% of the total operating allocation. So the most you could run into deficit is $3.4 million if you so choose. But and again, I would say that's something that would invite the scrutiny of the Ministry of Education, I would suggest. It doesn't mean you have to pass a balanced budget of 3.4 with a deficit in order to proceed with a deficit. But if you found yourself in the middle of the year and there were really dramatically unforeseen circumstances and had to spend yourself into a deficit, that is something that could be conceivable. And if you found yourself spending yourself into a deficit, you could, in that case, what would happen is you would draw upon the accumulated surplus available for compliance that you had built up, that $10.8 million, in order to balance out that deficit, until such time as you deplete that surplus available for compliance, and then you have no mechanism to actually deal with unforeseen circumstances. So, you know, I think probably not necessarily wanting to give trustees any kind of signal about how to manage their accumulated surplus available for compliance, but I believe in previous years that was kind of viewed as a reasonable risk reserve in the event that we got into the middle of a fiscal year with a balanced budget and you know, you have something like a transportation arbitration or something occur that introduces all kinds of unforeseen expenses, and that's what allows you to actually absorb that being able to draw down that reserve if you have to run a deficit in the middle of the fiscal year. So that's kind of what the idea of compliance is. I think the other thing that's really important to note is that even if you had $20 or $30 million in accumulated surplus available for compliance, you couldn't just spend it. The only way to tap into that is to run a deficit, in which case it draws down that amount, that reserve, in an amount equal to the magnitude of the deficit. And of course, because the maximum deficit we can budget or run in compliance is $3.4 million, that's the most you can draw down at any given time. With regard to, I think, the last point about sitting on $23 million, I think it's really important to note as well the dual nature of some of these accumulated surpluses. So on slide 9, for example, the actual accumulated surplus that we have available for compliance, and we just walked through that kind of definition of compliance, which is if I have to run a deficit, I can run a deficit of $3.4 million and stay within compliance. The only surplus that I can use to offset that deficit is that $10.8 million. In other words, the surplus available for compliance. The externally appropriated surplus is unavailable for compliance, and we cannot touch that. And as you know, as of September of this year, we're forecasting that to be at $8.5 million and then at $12.5 million at the end of the year. And that is really stipulated primarily for us to balance out the liability associated with employee future benefits. So that's not available for consideration for expenditure. It's something that we have to maintain for accounting purposes, and that liability that's several years old. So I think that is my best attempt at answering your question around compliance, and I hope I've done them some justice.
Great, thank you very much.
I will move to Trustee McPherson.
I'm going to pass. What I had to say is not really mundane to this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to to come back to the surplus piece, I think when we look at slide 11, which is the multi-year financial plan, which is really also part of our deficit recovery, our plan that we put in place post negotiation or post arbitration ruling for Steel. So when we looked at that, we anticipated that's how long it was going to take us to get to that level, those orange bars, as Superintendent Hobbs talked about. In reality, based on some of the things that have occurred, we are going to achieve that sooner. And so this is not budget related necessarily, because the surplus will be based on how we approach things each year. So this is a projection of what we would potentially be at. I think there's an opportunity for us to revisit that slide in that deficit recovery plan in the fall. But I think it's important for us to make sure that we send the message to our community that we're not anticipating to sit on millions, $23 million and not educating kids. The purpose for the 3% threshold was advice that was provided to us, if I'm not mistaken, through PSAB and or our auditors some years ago, is that because we have the ability to be compliant and still be at 1% in a budget year and run a deficit budget, still be compliant. There may be occasions where we need to go greater than that, not be compliant. But if we do go into a deficit, we have to recover that right away. And not having a surplus in place only means that we would have to take more of our revenue in the next year and dedicate it towards the overspending that we did the previous year. And so what this surplus plan really puts in place for us is the ability for us to deal with any of those environmental issues that might come up, and I mean environmental in a very broad sense. So things that might occur in any given year that would cause us to go into a deficit. And I don't think we would ever plan to be in a deficit, but there may be things that would occur. And so this allows us to offset that in the following year and get us in a better position to be able to deal with those things and still meet the needs of kids. And the reason I brought the other piece forward in the motion later on will help us determine that what we get in the year as far as spending goes, if we get additional revenue, that we at least have a plan in place to spend it. We don't sit on it and add to this surplus even greater. And I think having a $200,000 anticipated surplus, it's healthy. I mean, I have to give credit to administration. It's really difficult on a $377 million budget to be right to the line item of zero and be net neutral. And so there will be things that will come up over the course of the year that will get us either above or below, and we have to make plans for that. But based on the information that we have today, we are going to move forward with the anticipation that we would have $200,000 left over at the end of next school year. And I think based on what we've seen, every given school year, there's always little pieces that come up to play. And our biggest piece is to make sure that whatever we do get for kids is used for kids in that given year. So I'm satisfied with this budget, and I think we can have further discussions around how we would deal with our deficit recovery plan that we put in place. It was last fall or the fall before, I can't recall. So again, fully supportive of this budget.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Perfect example of the contingency to which you refer was our transportation issue in 2017, 2018, which we were able to address successfully, and here we are. So are there any further speakers? Hearing none, trustees, I would ask you to cast your ballot. Lisa, I'm voting in favor. I can't see. Okay, here I am.
Okay. Chair McAllister, I'm waiting on just 2 more voters, and then we should be good. Trustee McCray and Trustee Swan.
Mine's not coming up, but I do not support this. I'm against this.
Okay, I will document you as opposed. Trustee McCray.
Good.
And Trustee Swan.
I have a question. Are we not talking about the second slide presentation?
No, we've called the question, Trustee Swan. Trustee Swan,
Okay.
do you hear me?
Yeah, the votes are in, Chair McAllister, and the motion does carry.
Thank you. I have a secondary motion. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I have another motion. It's moved by Trustee McDonald, and the motion reads as follows. That any new funds provided through PPF, Special Incident Amounts, Rural Northern Education Fund, or any other possible deferred revenue streams be brought to the Board of Trustees for review each month beginning in September 2020. Such review will provide an outline of the purpose of the funds, the plan for the funds, and the impact on the current school year budget. I'm looking for a seconder for that motion.
John
I'll
Danaher will
second
second that.
Thank you, Trustee Danaher. Trustee McDonald, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did speak to it in the previous motion around the budget, and I really just want to highlight, this is in order for us to make sure that when we do get additional revenue, and we think we will, is that we do have a plan in place to make sure that we spend the money in the year as opposed to having to add to the surplus. So really only just bringing something forward that we've done in the past on previous budgets as well, that staff would bring that report to us on a monthly basis rather than waiting on the quarterly update. I think it's important for us to see the information as quickly as possible that when it does come down through the ministry. So just looking for support and ready to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further comments or questions? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot. Lisa, I'm in favor. I can't see your hand. Okay.
I'll support that.
Lisa, Trustee Danaher, I'm in favor too. It's not coming up.
Okay. All votes are in, Chair McAllister, and that motion carries unanimously.
Okay, thank you very much. That being the case, ladies and gentlemen, we are ready for adjournment. I have a motion moved by Trustee McPherson, seconded by Trustee McRae, that the special meeting and public session of the Upper Canada District School Board, July 15, 2020, be adjourned at 8:02. All in favor?
I'm in favor.
Jacob's in favor.
I'm in favor too.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries unanimously.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we look forward to meeting you next Wednesday at same time, same place, same station for an operational report. Do take care. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.